Hello, everyone. Welcome to Veteran Voices. And if you're coming back for another round, welcome back. I'm your host, Mary Kate Soliva, and Veteran Voices is a podcast where we love to interview, especially me, veterans who are serving beyond the uniform. And Veteran Voices is part of the Supply Chain Now family of podcasts and programming. So go ahead and check out Supply Chain Now. And thank you again for being here to support Veteran Voices. Veteran Voices is a proud partnership with the Guam Human Rights Initiative, a nonprofit that is very near and dear to my heart. And you can learn more about the great work this nonprofit is doing to advance research on human rights issues impacting Guam and Micronesia at www.guamhri.org. So, without further ado, I am so excited to have a guest here, a fellow veteran brother, veteran enlisted brother, retired Sergeant First Class, John Moses. John, thank you so much for joining me on Veteran Voices and for reaching out.
Thank you for having me, Mary Kate. I love the podcast, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak about life after being in the military and what it can mean.
Yes, I think you're just the epitome of someone who's continuing to serve beyond the uniform. And I just love the fact, I interview all different types of veterans on the show, but I especially love, we had that enlisted veteran connection right off the bat, that enlisted NCO connection. And I think that's just really special. And so I would just love for you to pump us up with a motivational quote, as I like to start out Veteran Voices with some motivation, some pep. Sing it if you
Yeah,
want, John.
I will, and I actually think you'll find this quote familiar. I don't know if it's motivational, but it's something that's inspired me, and it made me think about how I work and how I operate in the world. And even without hearing this particular quote, and you're going to recognize it, it reminds me of all the most important people in my military life, the most reliable people, the people that I could be around and understand. And George Shultz, the former Secretary of State to Ronald Reagan, big Hoover Institution person, part of the Stanford community, wrote a book at his 100th year. And the title of the book really blew me away. And it was Trust is the Coin of the Realm. And essentially, if you read the 13-page book, essentially he's talking about all of the best places that George Shultz went, whether you agree with his politics or not, were places that were filled with trust with his parents or his teachers or the president, or it didn't really matter. But I always loved trust is the coin of the realm, because there are people in my life that I've trusted implicitly, like in the military, people that were so reliable that you knew what you were going to get. And I hope there are people out there that if I do the right work, or if we do the right work, they'll trust us. And with that trust comes opportunities to do really great things for your community, or for veterans, or for whatever it is your cause is. But trust is the coin of the realm was the quote I went with.
No, I think that's a fantastic, and I'm so glad that you mentioned, just such an honorary with George Shultz was talking about him with Hoover, because we'll
Yeah.
get into that a little bit as well, as we're both Hoover Veteran Fellows. And I would be remiss to not mention that not only are you an Army veteran NCO, but you are also the co-founder of the Massachusetts Afghan Alliance. And I just wanted to, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But thank you so much again for sharing that. Now we'll get right into it because I love going into the background. I think that's what makes Veteran Voices podcast a bit different than other veteran podcasts, is that I do like to go to the grassroots and sort of get the origin story
Yeah.
of John Moses. So if you could tell us a little bit about where you grew up and some a little bit of anecdotes or two from that time.
Yeah, I grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts. So Lowell, Massachusetts is about 40 minutes west of Boston. Very blue collar town when I was growing, still a blue collar town. It was a mill town, very mixed town. It's always been an immigrant community. So part of my family immigrated there from Canada. So we have a French Canadian family. But throughout the years, Lowell, Massachusetts was well known for being an immigrant community, and also being very blue collar, and also being a
Mm.
very rough neighborhood. Right? It was back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when I grew up. It was just a place without a lot of answers. It was economically depressed, and a lot of that's changed over the past. I'm 45 now, so a lot of that has changed and it's better. But
So I
that's
was
where
like, you said 70s, and I'm like, you were around in the 70s, John? No way. I don't believe it.
I'm 79, but I got to live with the repercussions of the 70s in Massachusetts. So
Mhm.
But the great thing about it was is I met a lot of people. In looking back, maybe this wasn't the greatest thing for me at the time, but it ended up becoming just a great blessing. Was that I didn't really have a lot of opportunities, right? The kids from my neighborhood didn't have a lot of opportunities to do much of anything. If you weren't going to college, which I clearly wasn't, and neither were any of my friends, you joined the military. So I ended up joining the reserves really because I didn't have any other options. I wasn't going to go to college, didn't really know what to do. So I just signed up and I joined it. It was the late 90s. It was 97, so there wasn't really a lot going on. Didn't really do well with the Army and actually ended up leaving and coming back in after 9/11. But Lowell, Massachusetts is from where I hail, and it's where Massachusetts Afghan Alliance operates. It's very
Mm.
near my heart. We have a lot of Afghan refugees that live here now, so
I
that's
say
where.
there's definitely, I love the pride that you have just for the whole state. I feel like the folks that I meet from Massachusetts they're particularly from Boston and have a lot of Boston pride, but I feel like you're the first one from Massachusetts I know, just like the entire state. You're just so proud of the whole state of Massachusetts. And the fact that you even joined the reserves to stay in Massachusetts too just goes to show that you love your state. And so I don't know, vote for John. I know you're not with for office right now. Yeah, do that shameless plug for whenever you do decide to run for office in Massachusetts. What I do want to ask a bit about your family too. So when you're growing up, did you have any of the that influence as far as in the military? Were any of your parents in the military, your grandparents, did that shape or influence you at all?
My whole generation prior to me, not all of them. I have some uncles that served, but my direct generation before me did not serve. So my dad didn't, my grandfather didn't. My
Mm.
great grandfather was in World War II, which I thought was really fascinating. He was at the Battle of the Bulge. It didn't particularly influence me. I'm if you've met me, I'm pretty uninfluenceable. Like I just kind of figure out what I want to do. Um,
As a
but yeah,
cyber, I don't know.
yeah. If you knew how to take advantage of John Moses, I mean, it's not that hard, right? But I think I do treasure the fact that we have in my family history we have World War II veterans, we have American Revolutionary War veterans on the Moses side of my family. They were one of the founding families of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So New England runs really deep in my family. So um, yeah,
Like the shipyard? Like you
yeah.
guys what?
Port, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Moses family originally came from the England, right? So we came to the U.S. We were a shipbuilding family. We owned a pew, which back then in the 1600s, this 1600s, owning a pew meant you were a family of wealth and all of that stuff. And the Moses family was a family of note for a long time, up until about the Great Depression. And I think they lost all their land holdings, and we became just everyday citizens, which
So
ended up.
fascinating. I have to say it's a small world because like my dad literally works at the naval shipyard there.
Oh, does he really?
Even though it's can actually like Kittery, Maine, but it's like some folks will say it's New Hampshire and then I don't know.
Yep.
He used to live in Massachusetts as well, but yeah, I don't know. There's just like similar tie-ins there, which I
Yeah.
think find so fascinating with the family history. And that's why I ask, because some folks they did have that legacy line of their parents served, grandparents served, and I just recently discovered that I had a great uncle who died on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and we ended
No.
up it's so wild. And I keep thinking, like, when you mentioned about having a relative at the Battle of the Bulge, I'm like, who would have thought? Like, sometimes I think, like, we had ancestors who were in the same battle and then they didn't, who would have thought that their descendants would end up serving together, running
Yeah.
into each other? We just don't know those serendipitous moments. But I just think it's fascinating. And did you come from a pretty small, tight-knit family? Oh, you basically sound like your family started, like, founded Massachusetts.
Well,
But
I mean, that was
or
that
New
was
England in general, like I don't know, all of New England.
we really refounded our family in probably the 30s. That's when really like our family like emigrated to where we are now. And again, this is after we lost all our money, like whatever my family had at the time. Um, but no, so my family was huge. So I actually have like on one side five uncles, and then on the other side, including my dad and five uncles. And on the other side, it's the same, right? So we actually have quite the large French Canadian family on one side and a French family on the other side. And yeah, I came from a big family. We lived together for a long time. Again, when I grew up in Lowell, my mom, I wasn't living with my mom. I was living with my grandparents for most of my life, and so did
Hmm.
most of my cousins. And like my uncles usually would rent like the apartment next door, right? So I was really fortunate. I grew up in a really urban community surrounded by my grandmother, my
Oh, I
grandfather,
love that.
cousins. My dad lived one town over. My mom and dad were divorced. So I came from a large family, and I don't regret it. I'm the oldest on one side, and I'm the second oldest on the other side. But on that side, I'm the elder. So there we go.
There you go. I'm the oldest too, so I know how that goes. Good and bad. And well, that's the way to do it is you just keep populating everything and you just slowly take over that way.
Yep.
Massachusetts domination, New England domination. But no, I really appreciate that. And I wonder because sometimes I've spoken to guests on the show who were an only child, right? And they join the military and it's an absolute culture shock in so many different directions. Like now they're having to share everything, like share a room,
Yeah.
share your personal space, everything. Nothing's really your own. So maybe your rifle, but I just think that that's so interesting that you did grow up in that. So now you said you joined the reserves. Was
Yeah.
there tell us a little bit about that piece and
Yeah.
was it really a billboard? Was it a poster? I love to give a shout out if the recruiters actually did a good job because most of the time they did.
I've actually told the story at a Stanford event one time. So people join the military for a lot of reasons. Like you mentioned, sometimes it's because your family, right? I thought my family was really interesting and impressive and all that stuff. Not why I joined them. So I was in high school. I wasn't particularly popular. I wasn't like this confident, like older person that I am now. I was a teenager, right? I was 17 years old. And I remember two recruiters walked into our not dining hall, cafeteria. These two, two soldiers walked in and they were in dress uniform. And I remember when they walked in the room, a bunch of like this whole sea of women around me, like girls, high school girls, were like, oh my, and they like all turned their heads. And I was like, I don't know what that guy does, but that's what I'm going to do because girls are going to immediately like me if I have that uniform.
So I love that part about what you're saying, or you wanted to wear that uniform because that's all the girls like turn their head in the cafeteria and you're like, I want to be that guy.
I did. And I think, you know what, though? I mean, if you're looking at a deeper thing, right, it's about, joining the military for a lot of us was about acceptance, right? Like, I know I joke around about it. Like, hey, I was this young kid, I was insecure. Like, I didn't have a lot of options, right? And I remember this guy walked in, he was immediately popular, and like, that was something I could do. Now, did I do it well at first? Not at all. Like, I joined the Army Reserves. I actually didn't do very well at all. My first 5 years or so before 9/11. I actually got kicked out. So I went to basic training. I got my job. I was a 40 at the time, a 75 Bravo, which is administrative. Not really a job I loved. I was stuck in an office, and then I went to my first reserve unit, and it just wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and I didn't have the discipline for it. And but I don't. I stand by why I joined. I think I saw somebody being accepted, and at the time when you're a kid, you just don't have the self esteem. Like there's a lot of things that go into being a teenager, and I think seeing somebody be, just stand up in front of people and be so like proud and like unafraid and like everybody was attracted to not just the uniform I think but also their attitude. I think it left an impact on me for sure because I still remember it really clearly.
No, and I really appreciate your transparency with that because it's not something easy to admit about, getting kicked out or thrown out or, for in some cases some folks get demoted or other than honorable. But it's just like what we end up doing with the time afterwards, right? Like and not letting that bog us down. And you saw at a time where you were there prior to 9/11, and then when 9/11 happened and the world stopped turning, as Alan Jackson says, it changed everything. Many of us know where we are now and can't fathom the fact that we have service members now who weren't even born yet. But it's something that I think is a testament to you and your character. You saw that we were going in a time of war and you came back. And so, just thank you for that. And could you walk? I just think that's really fascinating. So what was that point for you to say, I'm going to give it another shot?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I was in the IRR, which is like ready reserve, right? So essentially, you're
Hmm.
still you're not. And after 9/11, I immediately called. I ended up calling a recruiter, even though it wasn't the person. Then they got me in the touch with the right people. But right after 9/11, I immediately was like, I'm going back in the army, not going back in. I'm going to return to the reserves, and I'm going to
Hmm.
change my job. I'm essentially not going to be a 70. I don't want to do paperwork. I want to go somewhere I can deploy, right? And my first
Hmm.
was didn't deploy. That wasn't their thing. They were a drill sergeant unit. And so I became a forklift operator, which has nothing to do with what I do in the real world now, but I became a heavy equipment operator. So I essentially learned how to drive trucks. I learned how to drive forklifts, how to drive wretches to pick up containers. And I ended up in a shiploading unit that deployed literally all the time. Who knew that transporters? I knew. That's why I picked it. But I ended up my first two tours. I mean, right after I came in, it took me 2 years to find a unit that was deploying. And as soon as I found one, I was like, put me on the list. Like, I want to
Hmm.
go unit overseas. I want to do that work. And then after that, the deployments kind of became more regular. As a transportation unit, I knew I was going to deploy every 3 years, and I did. I deployed 3 times in 9 years, as was kind of expected. So, yeah, that was why I came back after 9/11. I saw what happened, and
How long were they, John? Your deployments?
my my
Because
first. This is
that was
funny.
the time when it was so unpredictable. It's like the wild
Yeah,
card.
this is my first tour was long. My first tour was 12 months overseas, but they did multiple. This is the thing. Active duty people are like, oh, it's easy to be in the reserves, right? But active duty people get on a plane, they do a couple of weeks of pre-training, and they're on the ground in their country. Reservists, we did multiple 29-day ATs in Pennsylvania. We did multiple 29-day ATs in New Jersey. And so at the end of it all, even though I was only gone 1 year, like really reservists in the early 2000s, the first part of the war, I mean, they were doing 15, 16 months. And it never actually changed in the reserves either. Now they tell like people you have 9 month deployments, and it's a bunch of pucky, horse pucky, because reservists actually they have 3 months of training, which they just don't get a leave. So they go away for 3 months for training, or here and there for training for a while. They deploy. They still end up gone for a year, but now they don't get a leave. But fortunately, the war is allegedly over, so who knows what that means? But yeah,
Allegedly.
um,
Really,
it's
we're
over.
just in continuous pre-mission training status.
Well, I mean, are you so? I mean, just to pivot a little bit, I mean, I don't think for a lot of Afghan vets, I don't think the war in Afghanistan's over. I think
Mm-mm.
Massachusetts Afghan Alliance speaks to that. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of veteran-led organizations right now still trying to help Afghans. I don't think the
Absolutely.
Vietnam War ended, for decades, for the veterans at least, the veteran and the diplomatic community. So, but yeah, that was my first tour in Afghanistan, and it's just never going to end. I don't think. I think it's part of my life forever. So,
No, and I think that that's one of those things where yeah, I believe about things happening for a reason, and I like that it's actually imprinted on you so much so that you're continuing to do this work even after, it wasn't there wasn't a deadline for you all or the families that they're working with. And I think that the rest of us Americans, we had this in date, we're like, oh, we got to evacuate by this date, and it was ingrained in our head, and then it was like, okay, maybe help a little bit afterwards, but okay, they're good now, they're over here. But there's so much more work to be done, even the 3 years afterwards. And so I'm so grateful that there's organizations like the Massachusetts Afghan Alliance that are continuing to do this. And I like that play on words too about what you said, mass. Like you can really cut down Massachusetts to be the mass because it really wasn't just a couple of families. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. I'm looking forward to you sharing more of the stats on that in a bit. But
yeah.
I wanted to get on with sort of a, do you have any sort of mentors from your time in service that took you under their wing? Because you sounded like one of those. I just recently rewatched The Little Rascals again, and you just I just imagine the way you're talking about you and your friends that you guys are those that if there was mischief to be had, it was you guys. So
Yeah.
was there anyone that took you under their wing to be like, let me help you out, young John?
You're enlisted too, so I have a lot of mentors. I think I've learned there's a couple things about mentorship that I like to talk about. First thing I always talk about is you can learn from, great NCOs and officers or terrible ones, right? So
Mhm.
I've had mentors on both sides. I've had mentors that directly benefited me, like, hey, this is something but it was almost always through action, right? Like the best NCOs and officers that you learn from were people that actually lived the ideals they talked about. But I also learned a lot from NCOs and officers that weren't great and didn't treat people well. There's one officer, and since we're trying to talk about Afghanistan, he comes to mind. At the time, it was Major. His name was Major Peterson, and I remember I was the young E6, E6 promotable in Afghanistan, about to get promoted. Show up with this really hard charging, major. He's a ranger, like he's all these things, and we're working in an embassy for the first time. And he's like, "You're working in an embassy." And I remember one time somebody called or asked for something, and I was like, "I don't know how to do that," right? Like, kind of like sorry, I don't know what to do. And I hung up the phone and he's like, if you ever say no to somebody again, I will. And he like ripped into me and I was like, you in this office will default to yes. Even if you don't know the answer, you might know somebody that does. So if somebody calls and they say, hey, can you do X, Y, and Z? You don't say no. You say, hey, you know what? That isn't something that I handle, but I happen to know this. And what it does is it changes your kind of mindset when somebody asks you a question. You're not looking for a way out, you're looking for a way to help. And even sometimes you can help, but so often when somebody asks me something and I'm like, that's bullshit, I don't want to do that. I'll be like, default to yes. Is there a way to say yes that doesn't like interfere with me or whatever? But that can actually help that person. What I've learned from that one simple lesson that was reiterated that year in Afghanistan was that if you're if you're reliable and you help people, that comes back to you because those people might someday you might need something and you never know. So building relationships by saying yes was a big part. It was a good lesson. The opposite of that lesson I learned was from NCOs that beat up enlisted people that were
Mhm.
selfish themselves. Right. I learned a lot from selfish NCOs and officers that were really about them and didn't have that larger viewpoint of as the highest ranking person I had the least amount of privilege, right? Because you have to, because you're the one solely responsible for all of those people. So you should suffer the most is really what it is, right? But a lot of people push that down. So learn to say yes, and then treat people well, and understand that when you're the highest rank, you have the most responsibility, and the most responsibility to take on the most hardship. I think.
No, those are great lessons, and it could almost, somebody could put this quote as John Moses said this quote, and this is my favorite quote at the start of Veteran Voices episode in the future. But I really appreciate, I love what you said about the fostering relationships because this world is too small. I have come across the same people, even the bad ones, but the good ones, even for me as like a mentor and they were the mentee, it turned out years later, I was the one where they were reaching down to help me and I was the one that needed the pick me up. And so it's definitely back and forth, and life is just so unpredictable that it's not worth really completely burning down those bridges if you can avoid it. So very, very great point there. And and again, just valuable knowledge that you said from the enlisted, because I remember specifically an NCO that it's supposed to be leaders eat last. Well, he was at the front of the line, like every time, like we're in the field, hot A's come out, hot meals, and he's cutting everybody in the front to fill his plate up first. And I'm like, if you missed the leaders eat last book or memo there, because and you could just see the way that everybody looked at him, and it's almost like he was completely oblivious to it. But there's reasons for those different lessons, and it's just a matter of heeding that advice. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. And I think people, civilians, for any civilians that watch this, people don't realize that eating last thing is a real signal for enlisted people, right? If that person doesn't eat last or they're giving themselves all the best missions and giving themselves all the day off, enlisted, they sniff that stuff out early, early, early. And I think at a larger scale, like when we think about eating last, it's more about, bigger picture, like the big philosophy statement, like good leaders understand that you put your people first. And because they trust you, you'll get 110% all the time. And again, I was a new E7 when I got to Afghanistan. So it was a good
Mm.
lesson. When I was in E6, I had a real, who my best, no, I have one more mentor I want to talk about. And he was an E4 when I was an E6 promotable.
Feel free to name them if you want, if you
I
think
will.
we should send this to them.
He retired Sergeant Butler, but he was a specialist butler at the time. He was an older E4. He was like in his 30s. He joined late. We were deploying together to Afghanistan. And as an E6, I was a pretty calm E6. We're in the training, we're in the trenches, doing the work with guys, and doing all the fun stuff that E6s do. And then I got my P, my little promotable P, and I became crazy, like, rah, like yelling all the time. Like I was unpredictable, which is the lesson I ended up learning. And one day Butler is like, "Hey, can I talk to you just man to man? Like we're the same age. We're both like 34, right?" And he's like, "Do you know what the soldiers call you?" And he's like, "Forget about the rank for a minute." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "They call you Sergeant Yo-Yo because you're out of your goddamn mind all of a sudden." Like, and I was like, and I was so devastated. And then what I learned though, he's like, soldiers and people generally want they want something even, right? They just want something that is predictable. And but I took that lesson and I talked about I talk about that lesson with him every time I see him. I'm like, he changed probably my whole career because just not falling into that I have all this authority trap.
Oh, and that changing that mindset is huge. And so, especially to the fact that you were able to open yourself up to listen to that, I think is a testament to your leadership that you were even listening to an E4. Because I tell you that that doesn't always work out in in other scenarios where hey, your opinion doesn't matter. But the fact that you heeded his advice just is fantastic.
It was good advice and it was well given. And I think one of the things people don't realize reserves guards too is outside of the fact that you drill once a month. I mean, everybody's a civilian a lot of the time. So you get to know people. And that 34-year-old dude had like a professional job on the outside. He just joined the army late. And you have to kind of learn to respect not just the rank, but the experience level too. It's a good lesson as a reservist. I don't know if active duty gets that same lesson.
That's a fantastic point because as somebody who did 14 years active and 2 years reserves, that has still been the continuous culture shock, especially when I became a detachment sergeant, detachment NCOIC, and having my subordinates, if we can even call them that, or maybe E4 on the weekend, and then they're like GS 12 on come Monday, and so it's the breadth of experience in the reserves really truly makes us such an incredible force and sort of that secret weapon, so to speak, the value added and skill set and experience. But I really want to get into your transition because you also, with having multiple deployments to the Middle East, these long deployments, also having that active time, going back to reserve time.
Mhm.
You sound like you went through numerous transitions in your career, but let's talk about like your last transition that you had. How did that go for you? Did you feel like you had the support? Did you have the available resources? Talk us through that.
Yeah, so I retired in 2019. Towards the end of my career, I wasn't going to get E8. The Army decided to add another school, and I wasn't going to go to another school. And I was like, you know what? I have 20 years. I'm just going to retire.
Mm.
I'm going to be honest, retiring from the reserve. So I ended up in UCOM, European Command. I got to go to Europe a lot. I got to go to Germany. I got to do all this really great work towards the end of my career. And UCOM is a really unique unit. It's actually attached to an active duty unit. It's a little bit different. So I had great missions. But I remember when I wanted to retire, I finally. So first of all, when you retire, you get your 20-year letter, and you're like, "Man, I'm retiring. There ain't nothing you can do." That 20 letter isn't. It's no magic to that 20-year letter, because first of all, you have to submit to retire, which takes like a year, and you have to
I
write a
didn't
letter.
know this until like a few years ago. I was like, I have to ask permission to retire. I always had it in my mind that 20 and you're just like, bye. No.
You got to write a letter to the commander. And I wrote a really lovely letter. I actually put a lot of effort into my letter. I thought, the Army and I had given and taken away kind of in equal measure at that point. I had nothing I needed from the Army, and they didn't need anything from me anymore. But it was actually harder than I thought. So I retired. It took a few months to get my retirement. I had already grown a beard. So I actually did my retirement in my civilian clothes. But the thing that shocked me was, again, I'm a reservist. So a lot of people, when they retire, they're surrounded by other people. So, you have your unit there. But I mean, people from all over the country showed up for my retirement. Like people I had served with in Afghanistan, and like one of my first privates when I was like an E5 showed up. It was really, it was a lot. It was a lot. My mom was there. And one of the things when I retired is that really stuck out to me is the people who weren't there. Like my grandmother wasn't there, my grandfather wasn't there, and like this journey we had been on. And I was like, this is going to be great. I'm going to retire. And then, my wife went shopping or whatever later. We went drinking, to be fair, after, because that's what you do when you retire. And my wife found me like crying on the floor at like 11 p.m. that night, like just absolutely. It was probably one of the hardest transitions. It was just the reserves, right? People like, oh, it's just the reserves. But I immediately missed the culture. I missed the work. I missed the language of the Army because there's a whole language. You understand this. There's a whole language to the Army. And I just realized it was like this closing of a chapter, and it actually hit me a lot harder than I thought it would. Even just coming out of the reserves and doing the reserve thing, some of my best friends, I lost friends, in Afghanistan. I lost family during the 20 something years I was in. I lost time with my daughter. Like all the things I had sacrificed came to this one little point, and I got to say my thank you, and then I went home and I was a total wreck for a long time. And then Afghanistan collapsed a few years later, so didn't really get a lot, no peace for the weary. But no, transition's hard. I think it's harder than people expect it's going to be. maybe not everybody takes it to the extreme I do because I'm super emotional, but yeah, it was a really difficult transition to become a civilian and understand I wasn't going to go to drill. I wasn't going to see my friends. I wasn't going to get to talk shit the way soldiers do, all those things.
And I'm glad that you brought up your family as well, because we talk about the transition, and it's so important to highlight that the family is also going through that transition as well, even though it's really different for them. But you mentioned about the time away from your daughter as well. Um, what was that sort of that dynamic there for both you and your family, or I should say more so on your family side?
Yeah, I was so my first tour actually when I first met my wife. When I first met my wife, I volunteered for my first tour and I didn't ask her, which was a terrible idea. Something that soldiers do a lot, right? We do a lot of
So we're here for like the advice giving and lessons learned. So for those listening who are trying to get on their first deployment, let your spouse know.
yeah. Let your spouse know that you're going. But I fortunately there's less war now. No, I think we met young. We met in I don't know if she knew. I was in my 20s. I didn't really know what the reserve. In your 20s, you don't know anything. That's the thing, right? You don't really know anything. And so we were in our 20s. We were young. I volunteered for this tour. We went overseas. And credit to her, she stuck with me. We stuck together on it. And then I did another tour really shortly after that. And I still didn't have a kid yet. We were still in our 20s. But I think the support thing was, first of all, make sure you have your spouse's buy-in. I think it definitely caused problems. It always kind of, things like that will cause problems. But by the third tour, when we had our daughter, we had really kind of gelled together and figured it out. We're in our 30s now, like so we're kind of, and we had our daughter, and then a year later, I had my first opportunity to go to Afghanistan, and I was like,
Mhm.
absolutely, I didn't ask again. But this was a different situation now, right? So I'm an E6 promotable. My friends and all of my buddies are going to Afghanistan, and there was no way I was letting my E5s and sixes go without me. Like there was just no way I was going to be able to. So I had to make this choice. Like I love my
Yes.
family, my daughter, but like at the same time, I'm not letting Staff Sergeant, well at the time Sergeant Gordon go without me because
Hmm.
I'm responsible for them all the time. And so the dynamic was hard sometimes. It wasn't fair. And never mind the annual trainings, or sometimes I'd leave for a month to go load a ship in San Diego or go to Florida because the army needs it and they'll pay you to go do it. And I was like, well, more experience. So it's difficult though. I hope we get better at it and maybe stop going to war because I don't think people realize the second and third order effects of
Yes.
being very.
Well, thank you for sharing that piece. I just think, and I know not all of our guests share that, but I just think it's something important and unique compared to other professions out there. And really name any of them that are away like that. But not only is your loved one away, but they're in harm's way. And so I think that that's just an added level of fear and stress. So that transition piece. Now, I love to ask this of our guests on Veteran Voices because we may have transitioning service members listening, tuning in, and your advice that you would give to a room of transitioning service members now. I know you touched on a little bit, but
Yeah.
what would you say to them, those going through it right now?
Build relationships, make friends, lean on your family a little bit. Figure out who your friends are going to continue to be after you get out of the military. Some friends won't stick around. A lot of some will. Um, get involved. Big thing I have found that has helped me. One of the things that helped me the most is actually the Hoover Veteran Fellowship. So after all of that stuff, being around other veterans, whether it's a VSO, or acts of service, look for volunteer opportunities to do work with other veterans. Honestly, the thing that helped me the most in transitioning was being around other veterans. So I retired in 2019 and I went through 2020 alone, like
Mm,
COVID alone. And it wasn't great. It really was, that isolation wasn't really good. And then after 2021, the fall of Afghanistan, which was also an incredibly traumatic event, what it did though was it brought military people back into my life, and it brought the opportunity to help Afghans and do the work with Mass Afghan. But when I joined the Hoover Veteran Fellowship, and I was surrounded by people like Mary Kate and other veterans and people that spoke the language and understood the NCO humor and like weren't afraid to get like beat up and razzed all the time, like all of those things were really familiar, right? So volunteer with other veterans to do stuff, be around other veterans, tell veteran stories, and eventually you start to feel better and more like yourself. I feel much more like a retiree now than I did in 2020 or 2021 for sure. It took a couple of years.
I really thought I was gonna see you with your ball cap on, when the camera came on. I was like, where's that veteran ball cap?
There, it's over there. I didn't wear it today. I wore my Kabul John t-shirt for anybody that knows.
Oh, there you go. No, and I
I,
love I love the wall. For those who are just listening to audio, John has an incredible display of his time in the military, challenge coins and photographs, and I just love your wall. And we'd be remiss to not talk about the Hoover Veteran Fellowship Program and what it is. I don't get this opportunity to talk about it with all our guests, but would love to. John, you explain it, even though I was part of it too, but I would love to hear your thoughts on the program and
yeah,
what it is.
you're the OG enlisted person. So you were the person. So just before I even start, one of the reasons I felt okay with applying was because you were. I was like, this is going to be all officers, and it wasn't. And then I was like, oh my god, there's somebody else. So yeah, the Hoover Veteran Fellowship. So I'll start with Mass Afghan a little bit. So how I ended up with Hoover was during the evacuation of Kabul in 2021. I ended up becoming part of a team of people that were helping Afghans, navigate their way into the air. This sounds really simple. It was not really simple. Navigate their way into the airport and get to the United States as we promised, SIVs and all that. And our group ended up getting about 68 people out. One of the people in our group was a former Hoover Institution employee. So we got 68 people out. We continued to work, and I had this idea to build an organization to help Afghan refugees as they resettle into Massachusetts. And because I had seen them landing and finally arriving after all this work, and they're showing up and they're having really hard landings. The volunteer community is struggling, and I had this idea. And my friend, Hoover Institution person, her name's Liesel. She reached out to me and said, "Hey, have you heard of this Hoover Veteran Fellowship?" And at that time, like I had looked at tons of fellowships and they were all education based. And I have a regular old bachelor's degree. I'm an enlisted person. Like I didn't really have those kind of chops. But the program was different because it was picking based on an idea or the ability to execute on an idea. So you couldn't apply to the fellowship unless you had something concrete. And all I had was this idea. So I had about 8 days to come up with my recommendation letters to write. So Mass Afghan was
Eight
born
days. You had 8 days to apply.
8 days. Yeah, I was frantic. I got it in like 3 days before. I had to get like I was really fortunate. I've done a lot of really great work with my congressional office. They gave me a letter. But the thing that was most important when I talked to Jackie and the whole leadership team later was that you had to have a real idea. And my idea was built here and then put on paper for VFP. And my entire veteran fellowship program time has done nothing but improve my plans for Massachusetts Afghan Alliance.
Mm.
So for people that don't know on the outside, they pick about 10 veterans every cycle. And again, you have to have a full plan. You have to have the right relationships. You have to have the right motivation. And you have to be able to do something that at the end you can present back. And that's what made VFP different for me. It was a fellowship I could get in that supported me, not just with stipends and things like that, but with people and community and relationships. And, you get to go to the fundraising things and you learned about, I'm in the thick of it right now. We're about to get our 501c3, and all that time I spent in front of these rich politician scholarly types has benefited me greatly. Like how do I talk to somebody with, $100 million? I need 5 million of that. Can you like give me that? Like, so
I'm only smiling so big because I can totally relate to everything that you're saying. Like my cohort, the inaugural cohort one, was
yeah,
just we're as you said, I was the only enlisted person. So when they kept saying, Mary Kate, stop with the rank, stop making the rank such a big deal. And I was like, you guys don't realize it is a big deal. I was like,
yeah,
look at me, is this E6 staff sergeant, and you guys are used to briefing 2-star, 3-star, heck,
yeah.
4 stars, 4-star generals, and then someone like Condoleezza Rice. And how do you brief that? I remember hearing like Jackie Denise being like, "You need to breathe, Mary Kate. Remember to take a breath." Because every time one of the VIPs asked me a question, it was like I would just say everything like I was gasping for air at the end because I was trying. I felt like I only had like 10 seconds to say what I needed to say in 5 minutes, and
Yeah.
so
There's a
I
lot of
can totally relate.
there's a lot of imposter syndrome. It's not just me.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I mean, like some of the guys in my cohort, they were captain, like O3s, right? It wasn't like they were like colonels or anything. But yeah, there's like one day I went to an event and I was talking. I was having a great conversation about Afghan rights and stuff, and I was like, "Oh yeah, so what do you do for work?" And she's like, "I'm the former prime minister to Australia." And I was like, "Of course you are!" Like, and like immediately, like imposter syndrome kicks in. But yeah, the one of the things I loved about VFP was having an opportunity to meet with people at that level. And I think the
Yes.
thing I learned is that when you meet somebody like there are brilliant people in the world, and then you meet Condoleezza Rice or Mattis, or whether you agree with them on everything or not, or any of these incredible people we meet, and you realize there is a different level, and I'm just not on it. So like Condoleezza
Yeah, but
Rice when she
but they cared, right, John? They would be like, John, what are your thoughts on this? And I thought that that was one of the most incredible things with the Veteran Fellowship Program is you have this caliber of folks at the Hoover Tower at Stanford that are asking you, Mary Kate, what do you think? And they're like, stop focusing so much on the data. We already believe you. You already have this compelling story. John, you lived it. You deployed multiple times. Like you've seen it. You were the boots on ground. Share your story. And it's not something you read about in a book. We lived it, and they want that.
they do, they want that experience. I know I was super impressed when I met everybody from the Hoover Tower. I think, and just not only that, I think the
Like
quality of
General McMaster, you know,
yeah,
Vietnamese and Admiral Roughhead. It's just incredible, right? So,
it it is. It really has been an incredible program. It's been life changing, and it's helped me pivot a lot. It's helped me learn a lot. It's helped me avoid mistakes I might have made as a Afghan co-founder. Um, one of the things think the events they did the best, and I hope other professionals do this. I don't know if they did this with your cohort. They did a pre-mortem, like, hey, if John Moses was going to fail, how would he do it? And I wrote a newspaper article on how this particular human being could fail because I know all my weaknesses. So there's just a lot of value there. And I think, like you said, having Condoleezza Rice ask you a question and like respond, no, I believe you. That's being seen. That's really like, wow, my idea has merit, right? Like, oh my gosh, people listen to me. So I agree. The VFP is one of the best things we ever did. At least I did. I'm sure for you it's been great too. So
and I don't know if you experienced this, but I felt like there were doors that were open because of my affiliation, absolutely with the Hoover Institute, and doors that were previously closed when I would reach out to folks in the nonprofit space, in the counter human trafficking space, in the human rights space, that didn't give me the time of day. No callbacks, no responses to my emails. But as soon as I was able to get that letterhead, that signature block, it really opened doors in the legitimacy and credibility of the Hoover Institute and the staff and the faculty that are there. And I just, yeah, it's definitely been life changing. And I also started the Guam Human Rights Initiative, as a stepping stone through Hoover. And I wasn't even going to pick Guam. Guam wasn't even in my application, with as far as that goes, with focusing on that. That was not my initial, but it was through the help of my peers in the program that were, Mary
yeah,
Kate, you talk about Guam every 5 minutes, so you might as well, you should do something with Guam. And it's been so life changing. And I'm going to be getting on a plane actually for the liberation soon, for the Guam liberation
that's really neat.
80th anniversary, right? So,
And look at the stuff that's opened up to you, right? Like, look at these great opportunities now that you're finding. I think, and again, I think it's being surrounded by people you trust, right? Go back to the beginning. Trust is the coin of the realm. You went into VFP, and I went into VFP with open hearts and open ears, right? So, like, when
mhm.
I first started, I was like, helping Afghans isn't big enough for VFP. I got to help all, and like, so I made this whole pitch, like, maybe I should increase. And one of the first things Jackie and Denise and everybody told me was no. They were like, "Don't do that. Like, you have an expertise in Afghan culture and speaking to Afghans and what their specific needs are. And there is a community that needs you. So just focus on that, right? Don't try to distract."
Absolutely. That was a
Yeah,
huge lesson learned for us in the inaugural cohort. We were trying to do so big, and it was because of that imposter syndrome, as you mentioned, to try to be at this level with these global leaders, these names that are known worldwide. And we were trying to match that within 0 to 100, and it wasn't going to happen. And their advice was spoke so much more because we have an origin story. Your origin story started in Massachusetts, is like, and how much you love Massachusetts, and same with me with talking about Guam. And so I absolutely love that. And this is a great time to go into the Massachusetts Afghan Alliance. And
sure.
I'd love for you to share more about the organization, the work that you're doing, and how folks can get involved with your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that so again, if you I hope you have some listen hopefully you have some listeners in Massachusetts. But so Massachusetts Afghan Alliance was formed as I mentioned earlier after the fall of Afghanistan. I became part of a team, which for a lot of Americans that weren't really part of that, a lot of people, the war in Afghanistan ended with that 2 weeks on TV and they kind of watched it. And there were a lot of veterans like me, thousands of us that lived it, right? So we went through this incredibly traumatic, chaotic. It was almost like being deployed out of nowhere with 2 week for 2 weeks, no sleep, the whole thing, right? And when people got out, and just so you know, veterans, for anybody outside listening, veterans that went to Afghanistan love, for the most part, love the Afghan people, not the Taliban, the Afghan people that we supported for 20 years, gave education to, we did nation building for. And then when they came to the United States in such a hurried, like emergency way, and with something like 85,000 people still remaining in Afghanistan that have to come, not to mention families that were separated or families on humanitarian parole that are just in danger, there are still a lot of our allies there. But essentially, what I saw was as these Afghans were arriving in Massachusetts, there was a support structure from the resettlement agencies that help them with rent and certain things, but everything else falls to volunteers. So Afghans were arriving in Massachusetts with no friends, no family. There's about 2,700, no connection with the community or very little connection. So we formed Mass Afghan to do three things. We want to support our Afghan allies in Massachusetts with better programs, funding, other things that support the culture, Eid programming. My co-founder is an Afghan woman, Farishta Shams. She emigrated here in 2019. So she's doing things like Nowruz parties and like, how do we get Afghans in the same place so they can keep building their community? The second part of that I want to support is the volunteer community. So we lose volunteers all the time. We're in MOU discussions with a couple of big organizations, memorandum of understanding, that find better ways to recruit and to support the volunteer community. And our third kind of plank, until this is fixed, is a lot of families were separated during the Afghanistan evacuation. So maybe you got like a mom and a son here, but the dad and the son here in the U.S., but you might have a mom and three kids still in Afghanistan, and they're not together for almost 3 years now. So I do a lot of work with Congress and with the CARE team, which is the team that helps people out of Afghanistan now. But that's what Mass Afghan does. We're really close to our 501. We have good funding talks going on. And really what we just want to do is be a force multiplier, logistics, find a way to really help Afghans feel settled, make sure volunteers feel seen and understood and supported. And we just want to make Massachusetts a great place to land. That's it. I want Afghans to have a better experience on this side of the pond than that experience we gave them on the way out, for sure.
And I think you're doing it, and that you're doing an incredible job. And I just wanted to give a shout out to you with the incredible work that you're doing, because you didn't stop there. You shared with us about your deployment, the vulnerabilities that you had in your transition, how rough that was for you, but
Yeah.
you ended up finding a way to get back involved. And that's, and our listeners, whether you may, for those especially who are going through the transition, who may be already out, and you're missing that community piece that you have founded, John. And like you talk about the memorandum of understanding, that's that network piece, building those bridges, that we don't have to do it alone. There could be other organizations that are parallel, that are doing similar work, and you're like, hey, let's collaborate. And we're both enlisted. I just want to say about like that piece too, that I have so many of our battle buddies that self-select out of opportunities to even start a company, start a business venture or nonprofit, because they're like, I'm just enlisted. What do I know?
Yeah.
And it just goes to show like what you've started, John, and you're still figuring it out. But you're still making it happen. It's
No, I
incredible.
No, I appreciate it. And I actually think being enlisted it can be an advantage too. I think being an enlisted soldier, especially where I got to like E7 rank, where I actually had like operational responsibilities. I was an acting first sergeant for a long time. I made choices that didn't get me to E8, but I think at the end of it all, like as an E7, I ran circles around a lot of the officers. In reserves and active duty, not every guy that's a colonel gets out and goes out to a six-figure job. Some guys like. So I think there's something to be said about the enlisted passion to get things done, to execute,
Mhm.
right? And I think for me, being an E7, being able to point at a problem, my big thing is identifying problems. Like if I see something wrong, I'm like, that could be better. And then people will be like, well, you can't fix that. I'm like, well, I will try. It doesn't mean I won't, but I will, but I'm going to absolutely try to fix these things. And
I dare say to add taking care of people as well. And
yeah,
and just the fact that you co-founded with an Afghan woman,
that
I
was important.
just that was super important. But that just again goes to show about, putting ego aside and pride aside to be like, it's all gonna be John, like this is gonna be my organization, this is gonna be me. Like you found a way to do it the right way, I feel.
I will say one other lesson I learned, if we can go back to the quote thing. I don't know if it's a quote or somebody said it to me, but big thing I've always done my whole career, and I forget who taught it to me, was give away credit, take the blame, right? If you give away the credit and you take the blame as a leader, things go wrong, my fault. Things go right, it's your fault. So I've always found that worked really well with soldiers. And I always found that people that took responsibility were the people I respected, and I feel like respect people like us. So that is something I've always kind of stood by. Take the blame, give away the credit. Just do it over and over again.
That's so true, and it was something that we actually learned the hard way in our mock training scenarios too, where the key leader would be mad at us about something, and would be like, "Yeah, it's some guy in North Carolina, Fort Liberty." He did.
Yeah.
They're like, "No, no, no, no. The correct answer is you take the blame. Like you take ownership in that moment and find ways to get that
Yep.
mutual ground again." So, no, and I think that you did it the right way. You both are doing incredible work, your entire team, and you continue to find folks who are reaching out and engaging. So, for the folks who are in Massachusetts, reach out. Like, how can they get involved? What sort of, do you have any upcoming events or activities ways that folks can get involved?
Our website, so we're on Instagram as Mass Afghan Alliance. That's kind of the first follow if anybody's doing social media. We're also on LinkedIn. LinkedIn, we do a lot of work on LinkedIn. I find that LinkedIn is a good for transitioning members. Don't sit on LinkedIn. That's a piece of practical advice. LinkedIn, build it, use it, perfect it, like spend the time on it. I actually pay for it, and it's been one of the best things I learned. But Mass Afghan Alliance is on Instagram. You can check us out on LinkedIn, and please add and follow us, and you can add me as well. And then the last place is massafghanalliance.org. Our site's not, it's up, and we have a form there, but until we can actually advertise our programs and stuff, it's still kind of just who we are, like what our mission is. But we do have a sign up contact form. So we're out there and we're looking for people, and we would love to hear from more people for sure. Definitely veterans, more veterans.
Yes, and I think that there's so many out there that are just where you were back in 2020, just looking, they may feel isolated right now, but just looking for ways to reach back into the veteran community. And I appreciate that you've created a way to do that. So it's sort of a win-win for everybody, like helping the Afghan families, but and those facing integration right now and still integrating right now, but also for those trying to find their way in the veteran space. And we still have veterans who don't identify as veterans, but you meet them where they're at and they may come back around. But we just want to go to show that John Moses here, Mary Kate Soliva, we're a testament that as NCOs, starting these nonprofit organizations, we don't have a guidebook that's telling us the play-by-play here. There's a lot of trial by error, but we do it with an incredible team surrounded by folks who are just as passionate in figuring out and finding solutions to achieve the mission, which sounds very similar to what we did when we're still in uniform. So John, did I always like with veteran voices to sort of wrap up with how folks can get involved, how they can reach out to you in particular in case they want to pick your brain some more.
Yeah, my email directly is john@massafghanalliance.org. Anybody can email me. If you're not in Massachusetts, though, there are so especially to any Afghanistan veterans, there are resettlement agencies all over the country. Afghans are going to California, Texas, Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts, places like that. There are some small states that have very small populations of Afghan resettled, and they need a lot of support. If you are an Afghan veteran or an Iraqi veteran, I just hope you will find a local resettlement agency or volunteer group and help some Afghans. Just set up one apartment, like go set up one apartment, and you'll see kind of what the world they live in is and the difficulty they get coming here. So that's how you get involved. John@massafghanalliance.org. Volunteer for everything all the time.
And John, I would be remiss, I feel like, if I didn't ask you to share even though I like I know this, but what is in your words the so what to why the American people should care about the Afghans who are resettling here in the United States?
Yeah, because as a country, we chose this. So we made the choices as a country to do this during elections. We voted for the Afghanistan war didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened over four administrations of two different parties. Americans voted for people that continued the war. We decided to nation build in Afghanistan. And when people say support the troops, we're not talking about bumper stickers and free appetizers. What we're actually talking about is when we ask for help with the allies that we supported for 2 decades, is you say yes. That's how you support the troops.
Thank you. Ooh, I really wanted to end with the mic drop on that, and I think you did it, John. Just incredible. Thank you for sharing about and just being so vulnerable about your time in service, your transition, what you are continuing to do beyond the uniform, and you really are a testament to that. I know you talked about how you're involved with the school system as well. So, and what is that role that you're holding there?
I'm on the Chelmsford School Committee, Chelmsford, Massachusetts, and that's a fun fact because I ran because I was getting out of the army, and I was like, well, I want to do more volunteer things, and then I've been doing that for 8 years now, so that's pretty funny. So I actually joined the school committee. I ran. I was about to get out of the army anyway, and I ended up staying in for a few years, so I double dipped. But school committee, it strictly was there was no full day kindergarten in my town, and I was really mad about it. And I was like, I'm going to run for school committee. And then I won. And and then I've been here for 8 years doing that. But we have full day kindergarten in my town.
You make it
We're
sound like a reenlistment when you're like, oh, I'm just going to do 4 years and get out, and then we ended up staying like 20 years later. And me at 16 now. But I wanted to add that just at the end, just because again, you are just involved in so many things, and so I really want our listeners to let that sink in, to reach out to you and know what an incredible servant leader you are, just in the community, and to the families that are coming over here from Afghanistan and just the Afghan families in general in Massachusetts.
yeah.
So thank you.
And thank you for doing this and all the work you do in Guam and thank you for Veterans Voices for having me. This is really great. I love doing this stuff. So anytime you want me, I'll
Fantastic. I know. I was like, well, I know that I have to put some kind of cutoff because otherwise we go out for like 2, 3 hours, and then, I'm told the sweet spot's supposed to be about 45 minutes to 20 to
yeah.
45. So, but I really appreciate John. I definitely welcome you back anytime on Veteran Voices. And as we all say again, Veteran Voices is part of the Supply Chain Now family of programming, proud partnership with the Guam Human Rights Initiative. You can learn more at guamhri.org. And again, I'm Mary Kate Soliva, and as we love to say here on Veteran Voices, do good, pay it forward, and be the change that's needed. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you next time. Bye.